Hello, everyone. Welcome to our 9:15 Power of Story session. My name is Abigail Owen, and I will be your Zoom moderator for today. We are so fortunate to have Walter Parks with us today. Over the course of a 35-year career, Walter Parks has been a creative force between many films that continue to have a large cultural impact today. As a screenwriter, Parks is largely acknowledged as a pioneer in the development of tech thriller genres, with WarGames, a Best Original Screenplay Oscar nominee, and Sneakers starring Robert Redford. As a former head of DreamWorks Studios, Walter was responsible for the development and production of DreamWorks' diverse slate of films, which included 3 consecutive Best Picture Oscar winners. As a producer or executive producer, his films have grossed over $6 billion worldwide and included titles such as the Men in Black series, Gladiator, Minority Report, Catch Me If You Can, Flight, Free Solo, and many others. In 2016, Walter co-founded Dreamscape Immersive, the location-based virtual reality company which uses a unique body tracking technology to tell cinematic stories in which the audience becomes the main characters. Today, Walter is going to share some of his insights on how stories can be created and why they are so important in the information age. Before I introduce him, I would like to show a clip from Sneakers, which Walter co-wrote and co-produced 28 years ago, and which deals with issues that are even more vital today.
This is a talk about information and about how we as human beings are uniquely equipped to deal with extraordinary amounts of information by something which is sort of hardwired into all of our brains. And that thing has to do with the power of story. In anticipation of this, because this is a version of a talk I've given from time to time. I've given it to educators, and I've given it to intelligence analysts, and to writers, and to scientists dealing with computer science or with computer security. And it sort of posits that there's ways to look at story, and one way is as a way that we organize information in a very human and personal way. So since it's about the information, I always like to look at these things. Let me see where here we go. So I just want to talk for a minute about the information that's in the world right now. A little piece you saw, as Abigail said, that's almost 30 years old. Now we talk about the information in the world in terms of zettabytes. This is a term I never knew until I decided to think about this for this talk. And I love, these sorts of analogies. If 1 zettabyte were to be printed on graph paper with 1 letter on each square, that would cover the entire surface of the Earth twice. It's estimated that our data spheres hit nearly 60 zettabytes by this year. It's just an extraordinary amount of information on a sort of a temporal basis. This is what's happening in any 60 seconds. So quite honestly, since I began speaking to you guys, there have been 200 emails sent. So the question becomes, what are we going to do about it? You have governments and countries, companies who have literally created AI algorithms that are meant to do nothing more than try to harness all of this information to understand it and to sell us stuff with it and predict our behavior with it. And, computer science has sort of had to rely on the development of AI algorithms just because the size of it. Well, I posit, or rather than posit, I guess my question is, well, what do we have? And I think we have something very strong. So what does a producer from Hollywood have to do with all of this? I always like definitions like this. Let me just be clear that most people think of producers as, the money guy or whatever. But for the most part, producers are involved in one thing. They either know a writer or they need to be in the business of coming up with, making up, developing, acquiring stories. Because when you think about a movie's an enormous risk. It's a huge risk of millions of dollars for something that has no real value, no inventory, no real estate. It's just intellectual property. So it's either going to work or it's going to not. And the decision to spend millions of dollars is based on a screenplay, and a screenplay is based on a story. So as a filmmaker, first as a screenwriter, as a producer and executive, I've developed thousands of them. And I've come to realize something about film narrative, which is that is perhaps the most distilled form of narrative. Think about it, guys. You know, when you read a book, you can go back and reread a chapter. If you go to a play, you could step outside and ask your boyfriend or girlfriend, what was that about? Or you can look at a list of characters. Films spool out in front of you in real time. So that for a film to work well, the narrative values of it have to be deeply distilled in the experience itself. And in having done that, it made me think about an aspect of story in that regard. And I guess in some ways, this is the premise of this talk, that story is to intellectual information much as design is to visual information. That's a means, it's not the only reason we have stories, obviously, there's a deeply human one, but there's also almost an analytic one, which is that stories are ways that people can, for good or for bad, digest enormous amounts of information. So, you know, we live in a time where the word story and narrative are so ubiquitous, it's almost become a meme. And you're talking about the narrative and the counter narrative and the false narrative. I was with some friends where someone stated, she was a branding person, that the millennials had co-opted the narrative. And it's like, at some point you have to take a step back and say, when we throw this term around, what do we mean? So what we're gonna do is look at 5 basic aspects of story as I've discovered them in my years of developing stories. And hopefully this is of some value or interest to you guys, whether it's your writers or consumers of information, whether you're in the business of providing, reports or doing presentations or writing things that have to encapsulate complex information. Hopefully there'll be aspects of this will help you not only communicate better, but understand better. I kind of feel that we maybe are not all storytellers, but we certainly are story understanders. So let's start with 2 ways of looking at what a story is. I can say that the story is the depiction of a logically consistent series of events in which characters act or acted upon. And that makes perfect sense. And, you know, Job is acted upon and Macbeth acts, and one way or the other, it's a logically consistent, rendering of scenes or moments, and it adds up to something. I can also look at it this way. The story is a neurologically hardwired algorithm by which humans can understand or misunderstand enormous amounts of complex information. And as we go into this, we'll dive more into that. So when I say it's compressed or, a way to compress complex information, what do I mean? So if we were all in a room together, I would ask this question of you. I'd say, why is this not a story? A young mother loses her newborn daughter. Now, it seems like there's a character there, and, that's a sad moment, and you read it and you say, okay, I understand. But why is this a story? For sale, baby shoes, never worn. This is in fact a famous piece of writing by Ernest Hemingway. It's known as a 6-word novel. And what I would say is that the key aspect of why this is a story, and by the way, if we were in a room together, and I've done this several times, we would have heard an audible, oh, because you get it. And that moment of getting it is what it's all about. The difference between stories and other ways of presenting information is the difference between passive and active understanding. Ernest Lubitsch was one of the great directors of Hollywood's golden age, and he famously said, perhaps apocryphally, that my job is 2 + 2 and the audience's job is 4. It's that being led to an understanding which is so powerful. This happens in fiction. This happens in nonfiction. This is the cover of a report of someone I know quite well, I'm happy to say, Richard Danzig, who had been the Secretary of the Navy during the Clinton administration. And he wrote something about the inherent weaknesses of the national cybersecurity system, and entitled it, Surviving on a Diet of Poisoned Fruit. to me, those words provided a context to understand. We need these systems for sustenance, but there's something deeply wrong inside of them. And I found that by framing this narratively, I was able to understand a very dense 85-page piece. So finding that compressed meaning in something is really what story is all about. Now, what I'm going to do, and I'm going to just, I think we're okay time-wise. I'll go quick. I'm going to share a clip right now, which is a little bit long. It's 2.5 minutes, but I think it portrays that moment of awe in such a great way. I'm going to put it on. You're going to recognize who it's about, and then I'm going to say a few words about it afterwards. So that's from He Named Me Malala, which is a film I was lucky enough to produce some years back. And I met Malala. I knew her story, and I knew that she had been named for a martyr in the Afghani wars against the Brits. But it wasn't until Davis Guggenheim, the director, showed me this sequence where he actually animated the story of Malala and put it just right up against what happened to her, that this deep and tragic irony became clear to me. And that aha is what provided a story context for the movie. And that aha of allowing the audience to actively discover the connections, actively participate emotionally in the information that's being presented that is at the heart of storytelling. So now let's go through some, what I feel are 5 ideas that hopefully can be helpful to you in a number of ways that kind of get to the heart of what I've learned, which is that we'll start with this. As with the case with Malala, who was the main character of her own movie, it's all about character. It's about what people want. It's about their motivation. Guys should look this up sometime. This is a famous definition provided by the playwright David Mamet about what is drama. And it's the quest of the hero to overcome those things which prevent him from achieving a specific and acute goal. This is how we connect, through the depiction of a character. And as I've said, this is a very, very powerful tool. It can be powerful in positive and negative ways. For some reason, thinking about this little talk, I thought about QAnon. And I was asking myself, why did this crazy conspiracy theory catch on the way it did? So I went back and I looked to see what was the beginning of QAnon. And the idea of QAnon is that there was, and you see at the very bottom, a knowledgeable agent that inside of the government who is trying to give this information out. So suddenly information, specious and insane, these sort of conspiracy theories about Pizzagate, whatever, becomes a story. Because the real story is not about what's happening, but rather that there's this brave individual deep in the deep state that's trying to get the information out. It's that idea of the individual character trying to achieve something that's the heart of things. I learned this very early on in my very first movie, where the entire story was just about someone's absolute urgent need to do something. In this case, it was to play a game. We always have to remember that a lot of times writers think of action and characters as 2 different things. It's all the same thing. A character reveals itself and the story through action. I want to talk about something that we talk about in Hollywood all the time, which is the rule of 3. And if we were in a room together, I would ask this question of you all. Why do you think celebrities die in 3s? First, I'd ask whether or not you've ever heard this aphorism or this saying. And people have different ideas about it, but I think the real answer is you don't notice it when it's 2. That 3 are the minimum number of items to create a pattern. In fact, I even once found a mathematical treatise on the fact that if you have 3 points, that can only imply 1 plane, whereas if you have a 4th point, now you have ambiguity. So there's something very strong about the structure of 3. A 3-legged chair is always stable no matter what. In good stories, we always talk about a beginning, a middle, and end. Boy gets girl, boy loses girl. If you go into Marxism, the thesis and antithesis and synthesis, the Trinity, in fact. And in fact, I would even suggest that we live in a 3-act structure. We live that we're aware of the past. We live in the present. We're anticipating the future. So the idea here is that the 3-act structure is not, I believe, a construction, but rather it's a reflection. It's a reflection of how we experience reality as we live. And that translates to an extremely important and strong structure for any sort of story. I'm just for time, I'm going to skip by one thing, but I want to go to what I feel is one of the greatest examples of Threeact structure and just how powerful it can be, not from a movie, but rather from a piece of advertising. I find it very powerful. And once again, you can find this in Shakespeare, you can find it in well-written movies, the idea that there's a status quo, there's a disruption, there's a fight to return, and there's the creation of a new reality at the end. And again, I do believe that this concept, again, applied in any number of ways, is important because it's not something we have constructed, but I think it's something that reflects the way we experience our own realities. I talk a lot when we work on stories of the difference between plots and stories. And the best way to think about this is a plot is a structure or a vehicle by which a story is told. The story is a deeper thing. When I say here, and I hope people in the crowd are cognizant of some classic movies, but I could describe what to me is one of the great American movies, The Godfather, as the story of Don Corleone and his family, and he has to go against the Tatalias, and is he going to run drugs and etc. Or I could describe it that there was a king who had three sons, and one was an intellect, and one was a warrior, and one was a fool. And he tried to save the one who he loved the most, the intellect, from being like him, but damned him to be exactly like him. Finding these deeper stories inside of a larger piece is important. And again, it's important with your writing or if you're understanding something. You can be very confused by the superstructure and the surface, but it's best to understand what's underneath it. I'm going to give you a very a quick example of this from a movie which actually started my producing career, Men in Black. When you think about Men in Black, people think about Will Smith and the aliens and the style and the great gadgets and whatever. But when you're creating something like that, you need to base it on something deeper. And even if it's not there ostensibly, it's what's informing everything. So the truth of the matter is Men in Black is really it's a story about one person who wants to give up his life to learn how the universe works, and another person who wants to give up learning how the universe works to get his life back. And then, and oddly enough, once again, the power of three, this entire story inside of this comedy is told in three little moments. We've made 4 Men in Black movies and countless animated shows and toys, and I honestly believe none of it would have worked had we not discovered that deeper story inside of this, that it was actually about something. And again, it probably occupies 2.5 minutes of screen time in 3 scenes. Yes, that rule of 3 one more time, but it informed everything. And I think that all comes from having a very clear understanding of the difference between the deeper story you're trying to express and the plot, which can be much more complex. Which actually gets to the question of binary endings. And Abigail, let me ask you a question. How are we for time? When do you want me, when should we be done?
Well, we do have half an hour left.
Depending
on if you guys want to do a Q&A session, you guys
That's
can just pop them in the chat, and then we'll have a Q&A session within the last 10 minutes.
Okay, that's good. Oh, good. We're doing great then. Okay, good. So binary endings. Redwire and Bluewire is something I refer to, and I think a lot of people do, which have to do with the nature of most good stories, which they really come down to something happens or it doesn't. The hero lives, the hero succeeds, he stops the bad guy, he gets achieves something, he stops something bad from happening. It's pretty hard to find a story that doesn't have a rather simple binary ending. But there's something you have to understand about this, which is often its simplicity that can lead to the complex. In fact, if you're telling a very complicated plot, it's very hard to let the audience have a resonant moment where the complexities inherent in the storytelling become accessible, that you can actually feel them. as I say, Redwire Bluewire is almost a meme, or almost a saying in our business, but it actually comes from a very specific movie, and I want to share one of the last sequences in it. And it really gets to the power of the binary ending and the fact that through the simplicity of the binary ending, that you can achieve a sort of character or thematic complexity that is otherwise harder to do if the audience is too busy attending to a lot of different plot details. Back in the 1970s, Hollywood was very involved with making disaster movies. And a man named Richard Lester in England, a great director who's known for the Beatles movies, made a fairly unknown one called Juggernaut, which has to do with bombs that were put on luxury liners and a bomb squad that goes in to defuse them. It actually is very close to the plot of Speed, which makes sense because it's a movie I worked on and well, let's just say borrowed a few of these elements. Extraordinary movie, and it featured the greatest English actors of the time, but it's where the idea of the red wire and the blue wire came. So I'm going to just put on this about a minute and 30 sequence, and I want us to just kind of experience the amount of tension that's involved here, and then I want to talk about the complexity of the moment in a second. You're going to be seeing Richard Harris, who is on the boat, and he's speaking via radio to the man who trained him, who had set these bombs in order to extort money. I still love the sequence. And I've often thought, I've shown it to many, many writers, if the process were not the red wire, the blue wire, but rather it was, I see a servo mechanism and I seem to see 3 different switches. I think it's in a different order. If I go 1, 5, 3, do you think it would not have worked? Because it came down to a binary choice, it's the red wire, the blue wire, all sorts of character complexity came into play. It took me several viewings to realize the game Richard Harris is playing. He knows if he waits long enough, the other guy will tell him the right answer because the other guy is expecting to hear the explosion. So the first moment where this is changing is when he interrupts, cut the blue wire urgently. Well, that means that he hadn't cut the blue wire, and that's what he wanted him to do. So it allowed Richard Harris to make a choice. More importantly, it became sort of a chess game between the student and the teacher. And I think all of these things are available to us if we allow ourselves to be clear and to be straightforward in terms of the plot elements, the story elements, that will free up the character issues and the deeper thematic issues to take flight. Certainly in the case of motion pictures. And I will say one thing, as Abigail mentioned early on, I now am working in the world of virtual reality. These are elements that can be brought in, not all of them, but separately, and can be used effectively in many different forms of expression. I find in our VR work, it's very important for us to have interactivity and to give our audience agency, but it will always come down to a binary issue at the end. Do they survive or not? Do they succeed or not? And through that is a sort of a springboard to profound emotional involvement. Finally, what I want to talk a little bit about endings, and more importantly, I want to talk about the central ironies. I have found in the work I've been able to do, and when I look at some of the best work I've been able to experience, when we achieve this, when we find a deep central irony to our story, it sort of goes to another level. So this is a handful of pictures. Some I was involved in, some I just admire. When Aaron Sorkin got a hold of the idea of The Social Network, which is about a guy who creates the largest online network in the history of humankind, the largest network of humans in the history of our kind, basically because he wasn't led into a club. That sort of irony is, well, it's gold. We've talked about The Godfather. Amadeus, I don't know if you've seen it, but it's an amazing Academy Award winning movie about the life of Mozart. It's really about the court composer Salieri, who was only brilliant enough to realize that he was an imposter and that this foul-mouthed kid, Mozart was in fact loved by God, Amadeus, and was in fact the most important composer of his time and perhaps of all time. Catch Me If You Can is a movie that I produced. Very clear central irony. The Leo DiCaprio character is running away from the father who he sort of finds in Tom Hanks. And it allows, again, a sort of compression of meaning and a sort of explosive moment where, much like with the 6-year word novel, much like the moment of realize, oh my Lord, Malala was that woman. He was Malala playing out a destiny because of what her father named her. That these bigger ideas are sort of generated inside of our audiences as opposed to us spoon feeding them. And to try to do that, we need to have a sure hand on some of these key elements of story, and the central irony is one of them. So actually, this will be, I think, my last clip, and it is from Gladiator. And I think it speaks to, well, certainly in all the movies I've been involved in, it's sort of, maybe it's my favorite, but it presents the clearest of these ironies. I remember in so many times we talked during story meetings about Gladiator and asking, well, what's it about? And we realized it's really about a man who wants to go home. This is about a man who all he wants to do is leave the front and to get back to his family, who at the beginning of the movie are in Spain. And the deep, tragic, and yet beautiful central irony of the story is encapsulated, despite all of the action, all of the spectacle, and all of the extraordinary characters and Ridley Scott's ability. This central irony is encapsulated in, well, in fact, 3 scenes. I'm going to show you 2 of them. And I think it's, again, one of the reasons why the movie is memorable today. For those of us who, need to understand specifically what irony is, when something's intended as a particular meaning, can actually in some ways have a resonant opposite, a very different result. So let's take a look at this as an example. I should be having this. I should be in speaker view so I see the next card. What this allows us to do is to create endings that are both surprising and inevitable. You have the kind of the tug of inevitability, and yet you're not at all aware of the path that is taking you there. So he's asked to become the emperor, and Marcus Aurelius' son, Commodus, played by Joaquin Phoenix, discovers this and tries to kill Commodus, played by Russell Crowe. Russell Crowe rushes home to find that his family's been killed. The second part of this little 3-piece act, which I'm not going to show that scene. He becomes a gladiator bent on one thing only, which is to get his revenge. In so doing, he becomes a popular political figure and, in effect, topples the empire by killing Commodus in the ring. And at the end, in a deeply ironic way, he actually achieves what he set out to do. Of course, it does help when you have an artist talent of Ridley Scott to make a moment like that work. So we've looked at 5 ideas. That action begins with character, and that we shouldn't confuse the two. It's interesting when I have given this talk to people in the intelligence officers. There was a big shift in how we started to understand actors, bad actors. During the Cold War, it was all about ideology. It became much more about the charismatic characters, the Baghdadis, or the different, actually individuals with individual agendas. And it was very important for us to start to understand people, certain actions as the expression of characters. We talked about the rule of 3 as you're hearing my dog bark. The rule of three, not just as a construct for stories, but as something that reflects the way we experience the world ourselves. We talked about the difference between plot and story. The plot is really a vehicle for stories, but the deeper meaning exists in the story itself. We talked about binary endings. Never be afraid to be clear and to be simple, because out of simplicity comes complexity. A deeper understanding, a resonant understanding that's implied in the simple expression. And finally, endings which are surprising and inevitable, which are true, but that we as storytellers find our unique ways of expressing them. And as I said, I found that these ideas that can be taken as a whole or taken apart can inform not just how we write stories, but how we communicate information to students, to colleagues, to peers, and also how we can be more attuned to being manipulated, quite honestly. These are very powerful tools that can be used for great benefit or detriment. We're all aware of the false narratives that are flooding our political sphere right now. So hopefully this touches on a few of these ideas that will help us navigate a course through a very complex world that's defined by just too much information. And I think I will stop sharing the screen with that.
Well, thank you guys so much for coming. Unfortunately, I miscalculated the time for everyone, so we actually have to end now. Yes, this recording will be available. I will assume that it will be on the Learning Human website, but I will get back to you and let you know. Thank you so much, Walter, for being here. It was a complete honor to have you here. Unfortunately, we didn't get time to do the Q&A, but we have to move on to our next session, which is driving K-12 innovation. So thank you guys for all being here. If Walter has anything left to say.
Only that, listen, I'm seeing some very nice responses. I hope this is helpful to you. You know, I'm very blessed to be able to, you know, do this for a living. And if these ideas can be helpful to you in your business or just in your life, in your creative life, that's great. So thank you. Thanks to ASU, and hope to see you all again soon.